Hi YouTube, I'm Ali, this is Gaming Indoors, and this is episode 3 in our little journey into building a modern board game. Now if you're new to the channel, welcome. In this series I'm looking to take an old board game and breathe new life into it. We're taking snakes and ladders and applying modern board game mechanics to it to create something new and hopefully wonderful.
Alive! It's alive! It's alive!
Now along the way, I'm going to be exploring all kinds of different possibilities and options that we could apply to making our game that much better. Ideally, there's something I'm learning all the way through, but also that you are going to be learning at the same time. So the whole point of this exercise is for you to take away some extra tools and tidbits of knowledge that perhaps you can use in your own board games. Now, because I don't want this to be just a journey about me, I'm trying to include you guys in on this as well. So after each episode where I do offer some options, I'm also holding a vote. You can find that on my community page after each episode. After this episode, in fact, there'll be one. That vote is there to allow you to choose what option we should pursue in order to create our board game. From last week's we can see that we're actually going to be using a influence turn order. That means that in our new game, we're going to make sure that players are able to either bid for or claim their place for the next turn. I think this is really good. It's going to add a level of spice, a level of strategy that I think could be really, really enjoyable. Now, with all that said and done, I think it's best to start with today's topic, which is all about victory conditions and ending the game. Now, I started with location as my number one simply because I'm taking the idea of snakes and ladders very much as my starting point. In snakes and ladders, we start at square 0 and we have to reach square 100. It's very evident to everyone what the goal is here. We need to reach a particular location on the board. Now, of course, boards don't have to be numbered at all, and in fact, they don't have to be at the bottom going up. Games like Talisman from memory have 3 concentric rings. You have an outer ring, a middle ring, and a center ring, and the desire is actually to get to the center ring. We could do something similar in our temple. Maybe we have 3 or 4 or 5 or however many levels, and we're either trying to ascend or descend towards the center. So leaving location, let's go on to victory points. Now, victory points is probably one of the most well-used examples of how to determine the end of a game in modern board games. Catan uses it, Splendid. There are tons of games that use victory points, but I really like victory points to the extent that I've actually done a separate video all about victory points. And I'm going to say that that's going to be located here. I'm doubling down. I'm saying it's definitely going to be here. I've probably got that wrong, but hopefully it's either here or here. That's where I'll link to the video I've done. Now, one of the things I want to call out about victory points is, of course, it doesn't have to be victory points. You could put a resource here. In our example, I think our comments suggested using crystals as our resource. Pardon me. So we could have the first person to reach a certain number of crystals terminates the game, or the game ends when that number is reached. Similarly, you could swap it out for gold, you could swap it out for souvenirs. If we're tourists exploring a temple, it could be photos, for example. There's a bunch of things we could use. One of the benefits of using victory points, though, I do want to call out, is that it allows us to adjust the time or the length of play. If we decide to have a longer game, we might want to go for more victory points. If we want a shorter game, perhaps we go for fewer victory points. So yeah, I think there's a lot to be said about victory points. Third, we have fixed rounds or fixed events. There are lots of games that use fixed rounds. For example, the very last game I just reviewed, which was Night Market. Great game, don't forget to back it on Kickstarter when it comes out. That used 4 fixed turns after which the game would end. Games like Pandemic, a good example of games that use fixed events. So after the last event, I think it's 4 events, 5 events, whatever. After the final event, the game ends. Now, in terms of our game, we could really put some theme on this. Maybe we want to be thinking about day and night. Maybe a week passes while we're exploring or protecting or building the temple. Each turn would be a day, so we would have 7 turns to complete the game. Again, we could limit or change the gameplay depending on how many turns we want. I think the other thing we could do here is introduce something to do with the moon. I don't know why. Whenever I think of temples, I think of lunar sort of occurrences and sort of rites and sacrifices and stuff that are taking place in the middle of the night for some bizarre reason. So maybe we could have a really long 28 turn game. Who knows? Maybe. Number 4 is last one standing. This implies, of course, that there is some level of player elimination in the game. Now, I'm not a big fan of player elimination, but it does have its place, mostly in party games, I think. Games like Bang, for example, use it. Werewolf, Mafia, all those kind of games use player elimination, and being the last one standing usually, not usually, but always, in fact, determines the end of the game, or is one of the triggers for the end of the game. We're not going to use it because, like I said, I'm not a big fan, but I bring it up because you might want to use it in your game. Now, we've already discussed that lots of games use resources. Games like Pandemic or Ticket to Ride, for example. In Ticket to Ride, you have little trains. One way of determining the end of the game could be simply to run out of those resources. So if you've put down all your little carriages, the game end is triggered. And we could do something similar. We could have a resource that we use, for example, health points. If we're exploring, we could have health points. And if we fall down the snake pits, or we get attacked by snakes, maybe our health decreases and we lose lives in effect. Or maybe it's something a bit more generic, like it may simply be a collective pool of something, a collective pool of good luck, I don't know. And every time we venture through the temple, something bad happens and we reduce that pool and it affects all of us. Maybe that could be the finite resource that's triggered. There are a lot of possibilities here, potentially, and I do like resources because, again, it's another way of determining how long the game is played. The bigger the pool of resources, the longer the game potentially could be. Now, for the next two, I've separated them out as goals and as status changes. Let me just quickly explain the difference. A goal is something that a player would trigger. So in a game like Azul, as soon as you've covered your tile from left to right, I think it is. Is that right? Yeah, left to right. With one of each different tile, you will trigger the end of the game. That's a target, a goal a person has. I think there's in Ankh-Morpork, the board game, the Discworld board game, you each have an agenda that you need to sort of to achieve. If you do that, then you also trigger the end of the game and incidentally win the game, but that's by the by. You trigger the end of the game by completing that task. You don't have to do that. There are other ways of triggering events, triggering the end of the game due to achieving a goal, such as creating a connection between two places. That could also trigger an event. I can't think of an example where that's the case, but I'm sure they exist. Now, a status change is slightly different. A status change is where the board or the gameplay state changes in some way. So you may have a part in that as a player. You may do something to the game, but it would probably, but it may not be direct. In English, slowly. Tug of war is a good example of where the state is changed on a board game. Now, tug of war is a mechanism I've talked about before, and I'm a big fan of tug of war kind of games because I think it adds a constant level of tension and excitement. Nostra City is a game about mafia where you're trying to pay off a judge, I think, and there's a tug of war going on where you're paying off a judge and you're laying down tokens, and if you haven't paid enough that round, then the tug of war sort of marker goes across to one end. And if it reaches the end, then of course the game ends because the judge has sentenced your boss down, or maybe taken him down, or if it goes the other way, the boss is freed and he comes back and wreaks revenge or whatever it is. I can't quite remember. But the point is, a tug of war is a good example of where the state of the game changes. Now, for us, in our world of snake temple looting or protecting or building, what could we have? Well, if we stuck with a tug of war thing, we could have every time an adventurer into the tunnel does something, maybe they anger the gods, so there could be a little sort of tug of war activity going across where every time a person does an action such as build an amazing rope swing, for example, maybe it just angers them slightly and it moves the tug of war one way. Maybe the next player then has to think about whether they want to also do that sort of action where they increase the tug of war one direction, or maybe they want to counter that and help everyone out by playing something or doing something to reverse that activity. The point is, there's a little bit of contention there that I think could be applied. In fact, I'm getting more excited about the tug of war idea. Calm myself. What else can we do to change the state of play? Well, we could physically change the board in a particular way till we get to a certain point where once we've achieved it, the game ends. So for example, if we're building the temple, it could simply be that if we lay the last piece down, we trigger the end of the game because we've laid the last piece down. So yeah, I think there's some elements to be explored in both goal setting to trigger the end, or changing the state of the game to trigger the end. And that takes me to the last one I've got on my list of ways of triggering the end of a game, which is real-time time limits. Now, I think these probably apply more to party games, and I'm not sure our game is going to be a party game. I was trying to aim it as a family game, but there is no reason why we couldn't have a real time limit. Maybe we've got a certain amount of time that runs off a clock, and we've got to carry out our actions within that time. Now, that implies that there is probably a little bit more emphasis on getting our play done quickly, and given that we're actually doing a bidding mechanism for our turn order, probably isn't going to work for us in our particular scenario. But there are plenty of games that use real-time sort of time limits. Traditional games that are often associated, traditional family games are often associated with it. Things like Boggle, for example, or charades or charades or whatever it's called. You have a certain time in which to solve a puzzle, basically. So yes, something that is viable, probably not usable on our game, I suspect, and that probably won't be included in my vote, but it is something that may be applicable to a game you're developing. Okay, so those are my 8 ways I think exist to determine the end of a game. Now, of course, they're not mutually exclusive. That is to say, you could have a mix of them. Now, for our game, we might end up going down that route of having a mix of some of these, but for the vote, I think I'm probably going to have them separated out. I haven't quite worked out what my vote's going to look like, but I'm going to pick a few of those and present them out to you guys to vote on. So you're going to be voting on a choice of one of those, one or more of those, I think, is probably what's going to happen. Now, we've determined the end of our game, but have we actually determined the winner? Well, no, not quite. In fact, I think there are a couple of things we can add here about determining the winner that will add a little bit more strategy as you play. For example, if we go back to our original sort of race mechanic, our original bit of ending up at a location to trigger the end of the game, you could make it a race by saying being the first to get there. But also you could actually end the game because you've reached a particular location, but then award the winner as the person who's the last to have done something. So being the first or the last could actually determine the winner. So it might be, for example, let's say in our game, you've got to go past a particular point. Let's say there's a temple gate on our board, and it may well be that the first person to go through the gate and get to the middle of the board, in this case, triggers the end of the game, but it's the last person through that gate is actually declared the winner. Not quite what I had in mind, but something like that could add a level of strategy when we come to play, and you know how important strategy is in a game. Now, similarly, if we have the last or the first, we could also have the most or least of something. Now again, if we think of victory points, most commonly it's the most victory points will win. But what happens if it's the least of something? Again, we could add a level of tension here by saying that although you're about to do an activity, let's say an activity costs points to do, you might be using your VP, your victory points or your crystals as a resource to do something, but actually the winner is the guy who's used the least amount. So although you will trigger the end of the game by saying I've collected, let's say, 20 crystals, actually the winner is the guy who's spent the least amount of crystals. Again, something to think about that we could incorporate, something you could incorporate in your own game. Now, along this theme of being the most or the least, we could also talk about being the furthest or the closest to something, or furthest away or the closest to something. So if we have a finishing line or a location on the board or a set amount that we're trying to achieve, although something else could trigger the end, maybe you just need to be the furthest person from that center square or that middle square, or that furthest square, or you need to be the furthest away. The point is, being the furthest to or furthest away could also have some impact. And finally, we're going to go back to last man standing again. Now, this simply means that you've actually got everyone, and by definition, you are the only person playing in the game left alive, and therefore you must be the winner. So, yeah. Now, as always, I welcome comments. If you think I am going way off, or I've sped through this a little too fast and you've got questions, or even if you've got some ideas about how we could use these particular victory conditions or game-ending triggers in our game, I am all ears. I would love to hear them. The more I hear, the more we have to work with when we come to actually fitting this all together and building our final game. And we are getting closer and closer each time. For now though, as always, for now, as always, folks, guys, I was going to say there, guys and folks, gokes, yeah, new word I've invented. Take care.